Welcome back for another episode of Errant Adventures, the solo actual play podcast where stories are told at the speed of dice. With me, Steve Morrison, your game master and solo player. Now come on, let's grab the dice and see where our story goes. Welcome back for Chapter 14 of Book 1, Meridian. Last time, Inspector Lavash enters Rook's shop hunting Sejana Lushale, but she gets the drop on him. She convinces him to reveal his ID so she can get a name and a positive ID on the face she saw in Rook's comm history. She tries to convince him to surrender and give up his boss, but Lavash refuses. He tries to dive for cover behind Rook's desk, but Sejana shoots him twice with her stunner, knocking him unconscious. She ties him up and contacts Hallow, asking her to join Sejana at Rook's shop. Then she uses void magic to read Lavash's thoughts. She discovers he didn't contact Sybil Clementine about Sejana's location, and that he regrets it very much. She also discovered that he intended to call Rook to the shop and kill him to cover his tracks. And finally, he has a flash of a memory of a report that he read about a potential assassination of a retired naval officer who's scheduled to speak at an anti-government rally soon. Einur arrives at the offices of Zhang Imports for the second time in the last week, though this time it is with far less trepidation. Of course, Mr. Zhang could be displeased by Einur's use of company funds to purchase cargo for the return trip, but he doubts it. After all, the journey had been efficient. He's greeted by the same administrator and is directed to have a seat in the waiting area. Einur settles into his seat with a soft grunt and taps his cue, displaying the holographic screen with the day's news. He scans the headlines and frowns. More of the usual. There'd been a demonstration outside Cassidon University, Davensheer, yesterday. Peaceful, thank the magma flows, but the rhetoric was becoming more and more revolutionary. Calls for the Grand Duke to abdicate, for Parliament to abolish the nobility. All pretty standard fare. He swipes past it without reading the meat of the article. Of more interest are the trade reports, and Einur starts digging into them when the administrator clears their throat and says, "Mr. Zhang will see you now." Dismissing his cue, Einur rises and walks towards the now open door to the office. As he enters, his boss extends a hand toward the chair across from his desk. As Einur settles into it, Mr. Zhang summons a quick screen from his desk and steeples his fingers. "I've been reviewing the profit and loss statement you forwarded from your trip to the Alcatel system. Your first mission out after our discussion, and you thought it would be wise to spend company funds?" Einur opens his mouth to respond, but the other man raises a hand to stop him. "You were supposed to bring me back 80,000 rue. Instead, you brought back 107,300 rue." Mr. Zhang pauses for a moment, then a smile slowly spreads across his face. "Well done, Einur. You did what I hoped you would, and more. I didn't authorize any return cargo because I wanted to see what you would do, and you didn't disappoint." Einur grunts. "I'm glad you're pleased with the report. I thought it was a good opportunity to bring back cargo and passengers, and a little extra rue never hurts." "No, it does not." Now Mr. Zhang is smiling widely. "You've started restoring my faith in you, Einur. As I'm sure you've ascertained, this was a probationary mission. I'm satisfied enough to give you a real job." "I'm glad to hear it, sir," Einur replies. Mr. Zhang swipes across his screen, filling it with scrolling data. Then he flicks it to Einur's cue. "You've got a few days before you need to leave, but this is the next job. Transport to Creus in the Oragota system. You'll have a full cargo load for the trip there, and I trust you to do your best to fill the cargo hold for the trip back. I've heard there might be foodstuffs in need of transport in the Equilon system, so if you want to load the hold with goods for Equilon and make a stop there, you might be able to make an additional payday. Alright, let's take a step out of the narrative for a moment and roll up this planet we're heading to. On my galactic sector map, the Origoda system is northeast of Cassida by about 7 parsecs. That's going to be a total of 7 jumps because the Wolf's jump drive is only a jump 1 drive. You know, Zhang Imports should probably consider upgrading the Wolf to a better jump drive. Now, according to my homebrew travel rule, that's going to be 7 days in jump, with an additional 4 days cumulative of in-system time scooping fuel and refining it for the next jump. So this trip is going to be about 11 days one way. So we'd better make sure we can get Sejana back on board, otherwise we'll end up with a completely split narrative for a goodly while. But turning our attention to the world generation rules of Traveler, let's get started on Creuss. We won't necessarily do this with every world that we visit, but I think it's an interesting peek into the complexity that you can add to a Traveler campaign. Worlds in Traveler have a hexadecimal code that contains a bunch of information about the world. So let's go ahead and generate a code for Creuss. All codes start with the name and the hex location on a sector map. So we're starting with Creuss 0902. Next, we're going to add a bunch of numbers or letters to represent the starport size, population, law level, tech level, and other information. So let's go through the steps of world generation. Then we'll put it all together into a code for the planet. I think the typical referee when creating a world for Traveler just probably selects most of these options, but hey, I'm playing a solo game here and I like to roll on tables to give me details. So let's do that. Starting with size, we have 11 choices. Now, most of these tables start with a 0, so my dice roll isn't necessarily going to reflect the number on the chart. So I'll make a notation of what the number on the chart is comparative to the dice rolls. So let's roll 2D for our size and see what we get. That's a 7, which is number 6 on the chart. So that's a diameter of 9,600 kilometers and a gravity of 0.7 Gs. So it is not a kind of Earth-like gravity on the planet Creuss. Now, moving on to the type of atmosphere, we're going to roll 3D for this one. That gives me a 10, which looking at the chart, that is going to adjust to a 7 on the chart, which is a standard but tainted atmosphere. That means that people who are living on this world, they need to have some sort of filter on when they're out and about in the atmosphere to breathe. Now let's talk about hydrographics. We'll roll 2D again. That's a 10, which is going to be an adjusted 9 for this. That means that Creuss is made up of 86 to 95% water. You know what that means? Floating cities. All right, let's move on to population. Now, population has 13 options, but the first 2 are either none or only a few. And since we already know we have a job to this world, I'm going to go ahead and discount those options. So we'll roll 2D again. 7 on the dice. That is going to be an adjusted 8 on the chart, meaning that there are hundreds of millions who live on this world. Now let's roll 3d6 for the type of government. 12. That's going to be adjusted 9, and that is an impersonal bureaucracy that has become insulated from the common people. All right, well, that's interesting. So this government on Creuss is probably going to have a pretty strict structure of bureaucrats and then everybody else. So that could be interesting to navigate for our characters as they try to do trading. Maybe they're not trading with the government directly. I'm not sure yet. So we can also roll a D3 to see how many other factions there are on the planet. So I'm going to roll a D6. If I get a 1 to 2, it'll be a 1. 3 to 4, it's a 2. 5 to 6, it's a 3. I rolled a 1. Okay, so let's roll on that government list again and see what they're like. 3d6 again, that's going to be a 9 adjusted to a 6. A captive government. Oh, I don't like where this is going. The first thing that comes to mind is an indigenous people who have been subjugated by the former imperial structure. So let's roll 2d and see how strong they are. 6 is a minor group with some supporters. Finally, let's roll on the cultural differences table twice. First for the government and then for the faction. Now this is a D66 table, so I'm going to roll 2d and we've got a 4 and 4 for the first one. That is obsessed with something, a substance, an act, a personality, or an item. So that's relating to the government. Now for the faction. A 4 and a 3. They are peaceful. Oh man, it's even more sad as this is starting to come together. All right, so we're going to move on to the law level. This is determined by rolling 2d minus 7 plus the government code, which on the table is a 9. So ultimately we're rolling 2d plus 2 Dark Star. That's 12 plus 2 is a 14. That means everything is banned on this planet, weapons and armor. The government is probably afraid that the indigenous people, despite the fact that they are overtly peaceful, are going to rise up and try to overthrow them. And so they have gone to the complete extreme of banning all weapons, all armor, anything like that. So that could get interesting for our crew depending on how things go on planet, especially for someone like Sejana, who is accustomed to carrying her weapons everywhere. And I don't know, are the governmental forces on Kreis going to be welcoming to a liar? I think we're going to have to find out. So one of the last things we need to do is determine the sort of starport that is on Kreis. We'll roll 2d, and because we have a population score of 8, that gives us a +1 dice modifier. That's going to be a total of 7, which is a Class C starport or a routine spaceport. Not the best, not the worst. The class of spaceport affects berthing costs, what sort of repairs can be done, and the type of fuel you can purchase, among other things. Now, tech level involves rolling 1d and adding modifiers from the other things we've established so far. So our base is 3 plus 2 for the spaceport plus 1 for hydrographics plus 1 for population. So all told, tech level on Kreis is a tech level 7. So a tech level 7 is pre-stellar. A pre-stellar society can reach orbit reliably and has telecommunication satellites. Computers and integrated circuits become ubiquitous at the time of writing. Earth is currently somewhere between TL7 and TL8, meaning our society is like TL7, TL8. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there is not advanced technology on this world, but what it does mean is that if they're trying to acquire gear, they're probably going to be hard pressed to find more advanced gear on the planet. So with the tech level decided, we are almost there. With any spaceport, there's a chance for there to be a military base, a Navy base, a scout base, or a Corsair base nearby. Looking at the Class C starport, on a 10+, there's a military base, and on a 9+, there's a scout base. So I'm going to roll twice for these. So for the military base, no, that's a 3. And for the scout base, definitely no, that's a 4. All right, so no to both bases. Rounding out our world creation are the trade codes. These represent the particular bonuses a world might have for trade based on the rest of its stats. Looking over our stats for Creuss and comparing it to the chart in the book, it doesn't look like Creuss qualifies for any special trade codes. Putting it all together, the world profile is Creuss 0902 C67989 E7. If we had trade codes or if there were any travel advisories, those would go onto the end of the world profile. Now, this may seem a little complicated, but I like the idea of having this chain of numbers and letters that tell you about the starport, the size of the planet, the atmosphere, water population, government, law, and tech levels of a planet you're arriving at. And, you know, this is maybe not the sort of thing that I'm going to be using all the time, like I mentioned before, but I do think it's something that I'm going to try and keep in mind as I'm creating worlds and we're going to different places to at least add a little bit of flavor into it. We've done a whole bunch of behind the scenes stuff, and I really want to get back into the narrative. So I'm going to hold off on painting kind of a real vivid picture of Creuss until the Howlin' Wolf arrives there. So in the meantime, let's get back to Einur's meeting with Mr. Zhang. Einur looks over the data transmitted to his queue and nods.
I understand, sir. I'll have Ayati start plotting our course. It looks like we're waiting for a few more deliveries, but I'll get the wolf loaded up as quickly as I can.
Mr. Zhang sits back in his chair.
I know you will. I'm confident you will bring back a profit. Thank you, sir, and I'm glad that I've started regaining your trust. I hope you'll trust me more. On that count, one of the passengers we brought back from Strides is a young man looking to get into ship mechanics. He's got some skills already, but he's looking for a place to apprentice. I'd like to bring him on provisionally for this job, see if he fits in with the crew, and if so, I'd like to extend him a position aboard the Wolf. Obviously, I didn't want to make a unilateral decision until I talked it over with you.
Mr. Zhang frowns and says, "Does this young man have experience?"
Nothing impressive, but serviceable, yes. He could learn from me, and it would give me an opportunity to focus on being captain by maximizing profits and efficiency. We wouldn't have to pay him as a full engineer. He's willing to learn.
So does Mr. Zhang want to let Einur hire a new crew member? I think it's 50-50, so let's roll the dice and see what they say. A 3. Wow, that's a pretty exceptional yes. Mr. Zhang thinks for a moment and says, "Yes, I can see the benefit. The Wolf has been running with a very lean crew, and I appreciate that, but maybe you're right. Maybe it is time to staff up again. Bringing some fresh blood can't hurt, and if he doesn't live up to your standards, cut him loose." Einur smiles.
"Thank you, sir."
Mr. Zhang stands and extends a hand. "Einur, you've been one of my most reliable captains for the last few years. I'm glad we are getting past this misunderstanding." Einur shakes it and says,
"Thank you for the second chance, sir."
Saying his farewells, Einur leaves the office and heads out onto the street. On his way, he calls up his queue and sends Ayati a quick message. Luden is in, provisionally. We've got a new job, Departure in 3 days. Start plotting jumps to get us to the Oragoda system. Heading to Evraz. Be back to the ship tomorrow. Hey folks, it's Steve interrupting the episode for a mid-roll ad break. Before we get to that, I did want to mention that I have started a Patreon, so if you want to support the show in a monetary way, you can go over to Patreon and support me over there at Errant Adventures. Now on to the mid-roll ad break.
Are you looking for a D&D podcast with a dark side? Something more like Game of Thrones and less like Monty Python? Tale of the Manticore is part dark fantasy audio drama, part solo D&D RPG. There's no plot armor here. The dice make all the important decisions. Join me as I resurrect the excitement, wonder, and emotion of old-school D&D. Made for a mature audience, Tale of the Manticore is both a fiction and a game. It's the story where chaos rolls.
What has Ayati been doing while Einur met with Mr. Zhang? They've returned to Davensheer after a successful job, and now she's got the evening off. I think that Ayati's first task would be to send a comm to Sejana, letting her know that they're back on planet. Of course, Ayati isn't aware that Sejana is currently dealing with a corrupt inspector, so she doesn't receive an immediate answer, but I don't think that that's the sort of thing that really worries Ayati. She probably just assumes that Sejana is still at the hospital and is resting. Would she offer to show Luden the sights? I mean, I think that makes sense. So why don't we make a roll on the descriptor and focus tables to generate a landmark for Davensheer that Ayati could take Luden to. So we're going to roll our D100 on the descriptor and then a D100 on the focus and see what we get. 85 is safe. 32 is experiment. A safe experiment. Let me think about it for a minute. All right, I think I've got it. After Einur leaves for his meeting, Ayati turns to Luden and says, "Hey, since this is your first time in Davensheer, do you want me to show you around? We'd grab dinner and I could show you some of the sights around the city." Luden looks at the ground. "That's very generous, but I used up most of my rue getting here, and I'm not sure Captain Stargleam is going to even take me on." Waving a hand, Ayati says, "Don't worry about all that. Dinner's on me, and I love showing new people around the city. It's like getting to experience seeing it for the first time again." "Are you sure?" he asks. "Don't you have more important things to do? Friends to see? A family?" Ayati shakes her head. "Nothing's more important than helping a new friend feel comfortable in a new place. Come on, are you interested in xenobotany at all?" I guess so. I'm not really sure what that is." She laughs. "Well, then I'm taking you to the Anamnesian Gardens, and you'll learn about it." "All right," he says. "Thank you for being so nice to me." "I've got a good feeling about this meeting. Einur's going to get the okay to bring you aboard, so we might as well start acting like crewmates. Come on, this way." Ayati leads him out of the docking bay to the starport tram, which takes them to a platform connecting to the hyperrail station. They board a rail heading downtown, and as they approach their destination, it starts to get more and more crowded. Ayati smiles at Luden and whispers, "It won't be so crowded once we get off the rail. A lot of these people are heading home, and we'll have more open space once we're downtown." Luden nods, though he seems to be shrinking in on himself as more and more people squeeze into the tube. Finally, their stop comes up, and the two of them push their way to the exit, slipping out onto the platform. Luden stares at the towering buildings around him with slack-jawed amazement. Ayati grins, like seeing it for the first time. "Pretty impressive, huh?" "Yeah," he says. "The buildings are so tall and beautiful. They're shimmering." Many of the buildings here were made with reflective material to capture sunlight and use it for power. Ayati gestures at the buildings around them. It looks cool from down here, but a flyover is even better. There's a particular way light refracts off the buildings in downtown Davensheer that looks like a nebula in flux. It is beautiful, but it's also not the reason we're down here. Come on. She starts walking and Luden follows. As they pass the buildings, Ayati points at notable ones and mentions their use. There are a number of corporation offices downtown, but also the headquarters for the Society for the Exploration of the Unknown. I was part of the SEU for a few years, Ayati says, as they pass the building. It was interesting work. What made you join the SEU? Luden asks. I always wanted to be a pilot. She stops and clears her throat. I joined the Scouts and I flew with them for about 6 years. Then I got hurt and had to get out. Been kicking around as a transport pilot for the last few years. Luden watches her and says, "What did you do before the Scouts?" "Oh, well, there's the entrance to the Anamnesian Gardens," she says, pointing to an archway leading into a domed atrium in the center of an open, grassy area, nestled between the towering edifices of downtown Davensheer. They walk to the entrance, and Ayati swipes her cue over the entrance panel, purchasing 2 tickets. The doors hiss open, allowing them admittance to the outer ring of the atrium. It's here that Luden realizes the Anamnesian Gardens are not only completely enclosed within the dome, but there are secondary domes within the larger unit, housing plants from all sorts of different biospheres. A maze of walkways lead through and over the various domes, with quick vids playing on displays by each dome. "Welcome to the Anamnesian Gardens," Ayati says. Cassida was already an Earth-like planet when the first settlers arrived, but the other worlds weren't as welcoming. Before the terraforming projects began, seedlings of the native plants of those other worlds were preserved. Once terraforming was complete, the Anamnesian Gardens opened with biospheres representing each of those worlds. It was a lot smaller then. Now the collection has grown to represent plant species from hundreds of other worlds. Some of the biospheres are sealed because they're dangerous to human life, but others are walkable. Ayati points at a medium-sized dome in the distance. That one has a desert flower that grows iridescent in the moonlight. It's my favorite. "No wonder you brought me here," Luden breathes. "It's dozens of worlds in one place." "Exactly," Ayati says. "I figured since you haven't seen a whole lot of worlds, this is probably a good place to start. Come on, let's go exploring." Inspector Hallow shows up after almost an hour, knocking on the back door to Rook's shop. Sejana lets her in, and the inspector says, "I take it you found Rook?" "Actually, no," Sejana says. "Better than that. I found the person who contracted Rook to hire my assassins." Hallow's eyes widen. "No, it's not Clementine, is it? Is she here?" Sejana smiles, her cold, dagger-like smile. "Follow me." She leads the inspector into the front room where Lavash is bound and gagged, and gestures at the man. "Inspector Hallow, may I present Inspector Lavash?" Hallow stares hard at the bound and gagged man and says, "Tyron, what the fuck have you done?" Thanks for listening to Errant Adventures. If you enjoyed the show, please spread the word. And if you want to support the show directly, leave me a review or support me on Patreon at patreon.com/errantadventures. You can also buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/errantadventures. If you want to interact with me, my handle on all the socials is @errantsolopod, or you can email me at errantsolopod@gmail.com. I also post short fiction and campaign-related materials on my website, errantadventurespod.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the deep, liars.